The most powerful man in the world sat alone under television lights in the Oval Office 3 days from the end of his presidency and delivered a speech that almost nobody at the time understood. The newspapers the next morning moved on quickly. The public was distracted by the blizzard then burying Washington, D.C., and by the electric anticipation of a new young president about to take the stage. Most viewers watching their black and white sets that Tuesday evening expected the retiring general to deliver a warm farewell, a nostalgic look back at 2 terms, a patriotic send-off, a decorated old soldier riding quietly into history. What they got instead was something they had never heard before from a man like this: a warning, a specific, precise, almost prophetic warning about a force he said was growing inside the United States government itself, a force that could, if left unchecked, quietly consume the very democracy it claimed to defend. He called it the military-industrial complex. Nobody had ever used those words before, and very few people in 1961 understood what he meant. This is the story of how that speech came to exist, what it actually said, why it said it, and why a warning delivered 4 days before John F. Kennedy's inauguration went largely unheeded for almost a decade. To understand why the speech hit the way it did and why it was so unexpected, you have to understand who Dwight David Eisenhower was. Born in Abilene, Kansas in 1890, he had spent his entire adult life in the U.S. Army. He graduated from West Point in 1915. He served in World War I. He worked his way through the ranks over 3 decades, largely without ever seeing major combat, a frustration he carried for years. Then World War II changed everything. By 1944, he was Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. On June 6, 1944, he gave the order to launch the D-Day invasion of Normandy, the largest seaborne invasion in human history. He was responsible for planning and supervising operations that involved millions of men and the industrial output of multiple nations. After the war, he toured the liberated concentration camps and personally witnessed the results of what military power, unchecked by conscience, could produce. He later said publicly in a speech in Ottawa on January 10, 1946, "I hate war as only a soldier who has lived it can, only as one who has seen its brutality, its futility, its stupidity." That sentence matters. It came from the man who had just won the most destructive war in history. It was not a politician's statement. It was not a campaign promise. It was a personal declaration from the general who had signed hundreds of death certificates every Sunday during the war, one for every American soldier killed that week in his theater of operations. After the war, he served as the first Supreme Commander of NATO, then ran for president in 1952 on a Republican ticket and won by a landslide, largely on his promise to end the Korean War, which he achieved 6 months into his first term in July 1953. He served 2 full terms from January 1953 to January 1961. He was the first president subject to the new 2-term constitutional limit established by the 22nd Amendment. He was 70 years old when he left office, at that point the oldest man to have served in the presidency. As his second term drew to a close in 1960, he was not in good health. He had suffered a heart attack in 1955 and a stroke in 1957. But his mind was sharper than his critics acknowledged, and something had been building inside him for years, a growing unease about what he had watched happen to the country he loved since the end of World War II. To understand the farewell address, you have to understand the specific problem that had been building in Eisenhower's mind since the early 1950s. Before World War II, the United States had no permanent armaments industry of significant size. When wars came, American manufacturers converted. Car factories made tanks, appliance plants made weapons, farmers made swords when they needed to. When the war ended, they went back to making plowshares. The country demobilized. Defense spending collapsed. That was the American tradition. World War II changed that pattern permanently. The development and use of nuclear weapons, the emergence of the Soviet Union as a rival superpower, the dawn of the Cold War, all of these created, for the first time in American history, a demand for a permanent, large-scale, peacetime defense industry. By the mid-1950s, the United States was spending enormous sums year after year on weapons, missiles, aircraft, and military research. Defense contractors had become major American corporations. Hundreds of thousands of jobs depended on defense contracts. Entire congressional districts were economically dependent on military spending. Eisenhower had watched this grow in real time from inside the White House, and he had watched something specific happen alongside it that concerned him deeply. In 1960, a congressional report landed on his desk. The report showed that more than 1,400 retired U.S. military officers above the rank of major, including 261 generals and admirals, were employed by the nation's top 100 defense contractors. These were men who had spent careers inside the military, developing relationships with the Pentagon, understanding how procurement decisions were made, and who had then walked directly from their military positions into the offices of the very companies bidding for defense contracts. The defense industry was not just influencing military spending, it was being staffed at senior levels by the military itself. Eisenhower's speechwriters later documented his anger at a specific pattern. Defense contractors, aerospace trade publications, Air Force officers, lobbyists, and members of Congress from districts with defense industries were working together, each benefiting the others, to push for ever larger defense budgets based on ever more alarming assessments of Soviet military power. He had been trying to hold the line on defense spending throughout his presidency. He believed that a strong economy was itself a national security asset, and that runaway military spending would ultimately weaken the country it claimed to protect. As he stated in his State of the Union address on January 9, 1958, we could make no more tragic mistake than merely to concentrate on military strength, for if we did only this, the future would hold nothing for the world but an age of terror. On the evening of January 17, 1961, at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, he sat before the nation for the last time as president. The speech ran less than 10 minutes. Its opening was calm, almost gentle. He began by acknowledging that 3 days remained before he would leave office after half a century in the service of our country. He wished the incoming president well. He offered no personal attacks, no settling of scores. Then he turned. He established the context first. The United States was the strongest, most influential, most productive nation in the world. American leadership and prestige depended not merely on military strength, he said, but on how we use our power in the interests of world peace and human betterment. He acknowledged the permanent threat posed by the Soviet Union, a hostile ideology, global in scope, atheistic in character, ruthless in purpose, and insidious in method. He acknowledged that a strong military was essential. He said plainly, a vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action. He did not argue that defense spending should be cut. He did not claim the military was unnecessary. He acknowledged, in his own words, that the United States could no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense, and that the new strategic realities created an imperative need for a large permanent military force and a permanent armaments industry. This is a critical and often overlooked detail. The speech was not an argument against military spending. It was a warning about what unchecked military spending, combined with political influence, could become. He stated, "This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government." And then came the passage that 64 years of American history have not allowed to age. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. He then turned to a second warning, one that receives far less attention today: the danger of a scientific technological elite gaining undue control over public policy. As federal funding for research grew through university contracts, government grants, defense research programs, the nation's universities and scientific institutions were becoming increasingly dependent on government money. He warned that the prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocation, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. He added, "We must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite." He closed with a call for balance between the present and the future, between private and public funding, between military strength and fiscal responsibility. He warned against mortgaging the material assets of our grandchildren through deficit spending. The entire address was delivered in less than 10 minutes. He then said goodnight and stepped away from the cameras.